It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. When it comes to American politics, especially around the White House, these are wild times for the media. President Trump and other political figures attack journalists relentlessly. Partisan media organizations attack each other almost as vigorously. And surveys suggest that the public's confidence in the media is as low as it has ever been. One of the reasons for all that hostility from the president may be his frustration with journalists who have raised serious questions about his past business dealings and pointed out sharp contradictions between his promises to drain the swamp of the alleged incestuous relationships between lobbyists and policymakers in Washington, D.C., and the reality that once in office, President Trump suspended tough ethics requirements of the Obama years, packed his administration with lobbyists, and has been stung by revelations about his own potential conflicts of interest and business relationships of some top advisors and family members. Our guests today are two journalists who've been in the thick of those revelations. Vera Bergengruen is a national security correspondent for BuzzFeed News and previously covered the Pentagon, the White House, and the 2016 election for McClatchy Newspapers, where she was also part of a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative team. Stephen Engelberg is the editor-in-chief of the groundbreaking nonprofit journalism project ProPublica. He worked 18 years at the New York Times, including stints in Washington and Warsaw, and before ProPublica was a managing editor of the Portland Oregonian. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Let's dive right into the substance of the scandals and the controversies that have bedeviled the Trump White House. You guys have both been very involved in reporting on different dimensions and some of the same dimensions, but Vera, where do you see all of this going? What does it add up to?
I think it's a matter of right now, what's happening a lot with the investigation is following a lot of the financial dealings. It's kind of going down to as they've put more and more resources into looking at the different people connected to Trump, to the Trump organization, to different foreign entities that may have had influence in terms of following the money, in terms of just who paid who, what interests may have been influenced, whether they made any decisions that might have been influenced by that money coming them from Turkey, from Russia, from former Trump advisors, all these different things. I think it'll be a lot of trying to see a window into their intent, into whether they made decisions influenced by that. And I think that's where I see it going for the most part.
Well, I think you have two different levels here, and they're both important. There's a looking back aspect, and by the way, yes, we're in this nether world, but if you think about the sort of chronology of Watergate, 7 months into Watergate, we didn't know so much either. So I think, every day, every week, we're learning things that are quite startling about Trump and his business history and his campaign. The latest business that the presidential candidate of the Republican Party was negotiating a business deal in Moscow with sort of regime-connected financial figures while he was running for president and opining on things relating to U.S.-Russian relationships. That's unprecedented as far as I can see in American history. So that is going to be an ongoing story. At ProPublica, we're also thinking hard about the going forward story because there are radical changes occurring across the U.S. government in terms of regulation, in terms of approach to every imaginable thing. I mean, transgender in the military, the environment, climate change, business regulation. Who even remembers what's happening with Dodd-Frank and the implementation of that, the healthcare system. So I think it's very important that we not lose sight as journalists of the important effect that government has on people's lives, and that we need to cover the changes in that as well. So it's a multifaceted story right now.
So let's work through some of ProPublica's work around that. But first, let's talk about the Michael Flynn and Russia. This very complicated story that's really multiple stories that I think people get mixed up about very frequently. Is it about Russian tampering with the election? Is it about the idea that Russia actually threw the election decisively, that what they were up to actually changed the outcome somehow? Is it about normal conflict of interest of officials who happen to have ties to Russia? But what's the story there?
I think a lot of it was just not having revealed that he had these business deals, that he had these ties to them, that he spoke in 2015 at a gala, sat next to Putin, that he, again, was registered as a foreign agent when he was making decisions that he hadn't disclosed yet. The problem is just mainly that it wasn't disclosed, and then that when people asked about it, when it came to light, there was no answers, there was no transparency. And I think a lot of, going back to the White House, a lot of the biggest issues were the fact that they were repeatedly warned by people that he had these dealings, that he had this background, as he was in classified briefings, as he was making decisions for the White House. And the question really is whether Trump or Pence or all these people knew, and the White House over and over has said that they didn't know. They tried to get out of it, and I think a lot of it is, did they know that he was connected to these people? Because he was sitting in meetings when Trump was talking to Putin for the first time. He was making decisions as a national security advisor, and at the same time, what nobody knew was that he was being paid by a Russian-connected Turkish businessman and by all these different foreign interests. And I think a lot of it, my work has been looking backwards and seeing how he could have been influenced that way.
That's also where we then get into not just the conflict of interest of General Flynn, but also, again, the question of what did the president know and when did he know it, and to what degree would he have been involved in trying to obscure what had actually happened? I'm just curious, this is asking you to go a little beyond the straight facts that you reported, but I'm curious about, in both your cases, your repertorial instincts. Is it plausible that General Flynn would not have said, hey, soon-to-be President Trump, by the way, that's me. I talked to the ambassador about that yesterday. And is it plausible that wouldn't have happened?
I think we're in a realm where we need to be very careful about what we know and what we suspect, because there are differing interpretations that you can have of what we've seen. Certainly one interpretation which the Democrats have put forward is that this is the behavior of people who have something to hide. This is guilty behavior. And I think that's entirely possible. If you had asked me several months ago, would we ever see an email where key members of the Trump campaign were offered dirt from Moscow on Hillary Clinton and took a meeting, I would have said, they'll never write that down. That's ridiculous. That's never going to occur. And yet we now see the evidence of that. On the other hand, we have a president, and we all saw this, who when he's standing in the eclipse and somebody shouts, don't look at the sun, he looks at the sun. Because that's who he is. And I think over and over again what we see is that if somebody tells him not to do something, if it's going to annoy the media, the mainstream political views in Washington, he will do it, and he will then double down on it when he's caught doing it. So, I could see, a scenario in which the Comey firing and all the things that we now are familiar with are part of a very massive cover-up. Why does the President of the United States say to the head of the FBI, can't you let this go? Why would he say that? On the other hand, we have a man, again, who seems to just delight and glory in doing, first of all, whatever Obama did, he does the opposite. Whatever anybody tells him to do, he doubles down, triples down, quadruples down. I don't think anybody would say that his comments post-Charlottesville were politically astute, but once he was told he shouldn't have said them, this is what he does. So I don't know. I think we've got to be very careful not to get ahead of the facts and get ahead of the story.
Is General Flynn the sort of person who would have been engaged in these sorts of things and just kept it all to himself and been not particularly concerned about getting credit for navigating a sequence of events that President Trump was then very happy about? Is it plausible that would have happened, just based on your instincts about his personality?
Right. Well, I can't really speak to that in that sense, but it seems that just as someone that we know was engaged in these conversations, was sympathetic to these kind of interests, and who had every reason to believe that the president was as well in some ways, just because given his tone during the campaign, this openness to dealing with Russia, this kind of almost laudatory tone when he talked about Putin. I can't speak as to whether that sounds like something he would have done, but I would imagine that he, given what happened after, it casts it into doubt, but he would have thought that there was a receptive audience for that kind of talk.
If there was something in this sequence of events that really was inappropriate or seriously wrong, or is it plausible, that he just didn't understand the rules?
No, I think he understood the rules for the most part. He's an old veteran of all of this. And, we can tell because his lawyer reached out to the White House and told them, we're thinking of registering as a foreign agent. This was before the inauguration. We know that this happened. And we don't know what the White House really said in response to that. And then again came back and said, we're going to register as a foreign agent. And so the White House was repeatedly warned, and we don't know. The White House said they seem to imply that Trump was not notified of it, that Pence was notified of this. But clearly there was a sense that he knew that this was going to be a big deal, and that his legal counsel knew this was going to be a big deal. Especially the whole time in the middle, he kept working as the incoming national security advisor, sitting in unclassified briefings, helping the president make national security decisions, while they were talking about him registering as a foreign agent. So clearly, if not, you just register. Clearly, they knew that this was something that was wrong, that's something that was going to blow up, and then it did.
There are things the government does that are secrets that people don't know. One thing that everybody inside and outside of the government knows is that if you make a phone call to the embassy in Washington of the Russians, it will be recorded. Probably actually by 5 or 6 or 7 intelligence services, Chinese, Israelis, Americans, who knows. So the notion that you could first make those calls, then deny, in essence, making them, knowing the tapes exist, and then Flynn, remember, is part of the intelligence community back in the day. He was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He knows the politics of the intelligence community. You have a president who is just vociferously beating these people up, the people who have the tapes of his phone calls. How in the world, this is not talking about playing chess and getting 9 steps ahead on the board, how you couldn't have thought that that was going to get out and that it wasn't going to go well. I mean, I'm baffled by it, Vera. I haven't been quite as close to Flynn as you, but how do you explain that?
Right. I mean, I think that's, again, not having him on record saying that, but I think it's impossible to assume that he didn't know and that he wouldn't know. And there's a reason that he registered retroactively, right. That as he was serving as national security advisor and paid, almost $500,000 to lobby for these interests, even writing an op-ed in The Hill the day of the election, supporting these Turkish interests, for example, things like that. And still not having registered as a foreign agent. I mean, there was no disclaimer at the bottom saying I'm a lobbyist for Turkey. And we would know that that's illegal, and he knew that's illegal. And it doesn't take a head of intelligence to know that. And like, as you said, and just in terms of the interactions, in terms of knowing all of these different things we're going to get out,
it just doesn't make a ton of sense. And then you have this spectacle of the Justice Department coming to the White House and saying, he's vulnerable to blackmail because he's lied publicly about something the Russians know, and by the way, we know, and he should know that we know, so what are we talking about?
Well, and also, I mean, it's even more specific and more remarkable is that it's not just, obviously, General Flynn knew that this should have known that this conversation will be recorded and that there would be concerns about a conversation like this. Obviously, he should have known that. Whether he violated the Logan Act, an act that, or something that's basically never been enforced, but except once, I'm told, contrary to some reporting. But obviously, he should have known those things were problematic. But then you have the FBI visit his office and question him about this and inform him of this recording, which I don't think this has been explicitly said, it's still technically classified information, but I think that we know with absolute certainty that he misled the FBI in that conversation. And that is a felony right there. Whether you're under oath, whether you've been Mirandized, that's a felony. And if that's the case, that somehow, even having been informed that there's a recording of this conversation and what exactly was this all about, that there's still a denial and that there's still an unwillingness to then notify the White House, supposedly, or to try to clean this thing up. I mean, so much of this probably was repairable at any number of places along the way. But then you have the acting Attorney General of the United States come to the White House and inform the White House counsel that these things have happened. And again, this is what I'm trying to get at, is it doesn't make sense to me either, even if you are rooting for this administration. The smartest thing to have done at that point would have been to disclose everything, incinerate Flynn on the spot, and then the White House probably could have extricated it. So there has to be some explanation for why that didn't happen. And so as a reporter, part of what we do as reporters is try to think about, okay, what might be the explanation, then how do I figure out which ones of these things might be the true one? What do you go looking for there?
Well, I mean, one thing that comes to mind, when I joined the New York Times Washington Bureau, one of the reporters there was a veteran of the Watergate investigation, and he said to me something that I've always kept close to my heart and head. He said, they always said in Watergate the cover-up is worse than the crime. And he said, sometimes the crime is so bad, you have to cover it up. And you should not always assume that because people are covering things up, they're stupid. There may be something to cover up that actually is quite horrific. And we don't know that. But I think as a reporter, you have to at least contain multiple hypotheses, and that is certainly one explanation of the behavior we've seen.
And I think we're dealing with someone in the president who sometimes seemed to act against his own best interest, political interest, someone who wasn't a politician before. And it's very, to me as a reporter, as we were looking at this, it's why would he go against his own interest in this case? You know, is it because his personality is to be, we know that he's fiercely loyal to certain people who came out for him early, like Flynn did. He likes strong military men. He really likes his generals. He really liked seeing Flynn come out on the campaign trail and, you know, speak on stage and, you know, to talk about Clinton. And is it just loyalty to that? Because that he would go above and beyond to ask Comey to drop him, to do all these different things, and to still be talking, you know, trying to communicate with him, trying to communicate with Flynn when everyone's telling him it's a really bad idea, just get him out, just drop it, you do not want to be tied to him. Is it just a facet of his personality? He feels intense loyalty for this man who went out on a limb for him. Or is it something else? And it's really difficult sometimes to separate that when you're covering somebody who often doesn't act in the way that we think a rational politician would act. And so,
Now I have to jump in though there, and again, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but you say he's intensely loyal. Surely there was nobody more politically valuable at a certain point than Jeff Sessions, and yet we don't see enormous personal loyalty. That didn't seem to cut much ice in the end. So I think we have, to this day, a mystery as to why this would happen. And, you know, Bannon said in a recent interview the firing of Comey was one of the greatest political mistakes of all time. Absolutely true. And yet, frankly, utterly predictable that if you fire the director of the FBI in the midst of an investigation like this, that there will be calls for a special counsel. And so that was not, anyone who's been in Washington for 5 minutes, ask Bill Clinton, you know, and then it goes badly.
And, you know, again, not helping his case, saying, you know, that's fine, do what you need, do not look into my finances, or, you know, things like that. You know, legal experts I talk to, they say they keep pointing out that a president is not a normal defendant when these things happen. You know, I heard an example recently that was saying, you know, they're accusing you of murder, and you say, no, I was robbing the house, I was in there, but, you know, I didn't murder the guy, I left before that happened. Things like that. You know, presidents just, even if it's something here, then it will be hugely damaging. If it's something here, it's even more damaging. And so not just this, not unique to Trump, previous presidents, you deny everything. You just don't talk about it. You know, it's easy for us to sit there and say, why don't you just admit if it was this deal, if it was this contact? And I think it's important to realize that a president is not a normal person in a normal trial.
Right, but so then where does that leave us? And I think it leaves us in a very strange place, because unlike the Watergate situation, where you had a joint committee of Congress examining the events and reporting to the public, or even in Iran-Contra, where you had things like that, here Mueller's main job is to identify prosecutable crimes and to bring charges. So where are we left as a country if he discovers things that aren't crimes but are important to the republic, potentially even impeachable? I mean, there's no sense that I have that he has to report those things. I don't think you're in Washington, Vera. Do you have a sense that these congressional committees are going to end up doing a thorough report on the events here?
Well, they're kind of also constricted as to what they're trying to find. And I think that's what's interesting of being a journalist, or for investigative journalists, they're doing their job and we're doing ours, and we're finding things that they're not even looking at because that's not their job to find. And so I think sometimes a lot of people are, you know, again, looking at, let's say, into his company, into different things, we find things that have nothing, that are still damaging, but that they weren't even looking at. And sometimes they will come out with a little finding, or there will be a leak about something that they're looking at, and it makes clear a lot of things that we were already looking at for the last 2 years. So I think it's just so broad and it's so slow moving.
Is it possible that journalists between Watergate and now, that in the way that Watergate inspired a generation, certainly us, in a very direct way, to see the importance of investigative journalism, to see the importance of media as this bulwark against a government that had lied to the people, not just during Watergate, but during Vietnam, and that huge response of journalists as the protectors of the truth against a government that appeared more corrupt than Americans had previously really wanted to imagine. Is it possible that we actually carried it all a bit too far, that we made mountains out of molehills over and over again. I look back at stories that I wrote about city councilmen 25 years ago, and even some who ultimately went to jail, but scandals that I was uncovering working for a local newspaper and such. I can look back on them now and say, you know, maybe that actually was a little overheated, and maybe I contributed to the public sense that I can't trust anybody, and now finally that can't trust anybody is applied to the media as well. Is there any possibility of that?
I just think, I mean, I think a lot of these stories don't need that help. We are not, you know, they don't need to be made molehills because they're giant. A lot of these things that are happening, sometimes I'm looking at them and trying to put myself in my shoes a year ago, and they're just so crazy. A lot of these, you know, a lot of what's happening right now, and it's the biggest story of our times. And I think, yes, I mean, there's the temptation sometimes to say things that really aren't that important and blow them up. But I do think that a lot of what's happening, in a way, sometimes I think is almost being undercovered because it's because we've normalized a lot of these things.
Well, as the literal and figurative graybeard on this panel, I think you have a point, Doug. And I don't know what the answer is to it because. On the one hand, some of the things over the years that have become gates, Travelgate or whatever, you know, things no one even remembers that was during the Clinton years, they hardly merited a gate. And I think we did on some level in our aggressive pursuit of wrongdoing by public figures and companies, you know, lower the public's trust in some of these institutions. On the other hand, and I think back on it, a lot of the things that we held accountable really needed to be held accountable. And, you know, I think this is kind of an inevitable process where you have a press corps that's going to dig into things, and some of them are going to turn out to have been bigger deals than others. But I think the alternative, which is to say, okay, let's not write so many negative stories, you end up with Bell, California, which was a small community about an hour from the LA Times newsroom that nobody covered, and had a city council that had quiet meetings that were attended by nobody and voted themselves $900,000 a year salaries. And eventually the LA Times exposed this and won a Pulitzer Prize, as they should have. So, I mean, I think, you know, as between too much scrutiny and too little scrutiny, I will take, you know, more rather than less, but I think we have to acknowledge that, yes, this does harm the public's basic faith that anybody's telling the truth about anything. And has it come back to hit us? Yes, it has.
Yeah, well, I've long called myself an apocalyptic optimist. I was saying this back when the fear was TV and nobody even heard of the internet, but that this giant transformation, this apocalypse was coming, which it has come, particularly for anybody who made a career in the newspaper business. The apocalypse came, but I've been an apocalyptic optimist in the sense that I do still have the faith that on the other side of the moonscape of the apocalypse, that there is this unpredictable world with lots of little things blossoming, like BuzzFeed, and hopefully that will all work in a way that it serves our democracy in the way that we need it.
I mean, in this period, I would add that ProPublica has gotten record amounts of money contributed, and to me, the most touching is not the foundations and so on, although that's wonderful and important support. It's the people who write in and say, I'm out of work, I'm sending you $40, it's all I've got, please, you know, keep our democracy going. And we have lots and lots of people who write notes like that. And I guess I still get up every morning and believe that providing factual information in the long run will, you know, keep our democracy where it needs to be.
Vera, do younger Americans see somebody like you and say, okay, actually, because you're a little closer in age to whoever this imaginary person is, do they look at you and say, okay, this is a really serious person, but who's kind of like me, I think, and is operating in this new realm of media that I'm a little more comfortable with? Do you feel a particular burden of any sort that comes with that? And I mean, it's not a bad burden, but I mean, do you sort of owe something to them, or is that out there?
I think it is kind of out there. Especially on young people, there was this kind of, you know, I had a lot of friends and a lot of just people I know who all were saying, I'm subscribing for the first time. I would rather pay for Netflix, but I'm going to pay for the New York Times, I'm going to pay for the Washington Post. You know, a lot of people took pride in that, and they're realizing the importance of journalism. But I think there also is a sense that, you know, the generation that they trust is leaving, and people my age, you know, we're working in this different environment where we're not going. You know, they see. They look at Watergate, they look at all these different things, and in this generation that did all this kind of reporting. And I think it's given the environment that people like me are operating in, I think sometimes it's a bit of, okay, let's make sure we're learning from the best and can kind of keep doing that kind of work, because otherwise everyone's still operating in their own little sphere. But I do see it's a huge interest in that. And I think it says a lot that they think that it's only the press keeping them from, not knowing what's going on.
Well, you're giving me a lot of confidence, so I'm glad to see you out there. Vera Bergen-Gruen, Steven Engelberg, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you'll join our ongoing conversations about the presidency, the major issues that face the nation, journalism, and how to restore civility and an appreciation of history, and just simple decency to the way we all engage in democracy. To watch this and other episodes of American Forum, read transcripts, or find other resources, go to our website or the Miller Center Facebook page. And of course, keep watching us on your local PBS station. If you have a question or comment, you can reach me on Twitter at Douglas Blackman. You can find our guests at STEV Engelberg and at Vera M. Bergen. See you next week.